Okay, let's continue on now with the World War II and finish up the war in the Pacific. Last class period, we looked at the war in Europe. Prior to that, we talked about America getting involved in Pearl Harbor and America preparing for the war, and then went back to Europe and picked it up there with the Americans, with us getting involved, and ran through the end of the war in Europe. Today we're going to drop back to Pearl Harbor again, but this time look at the war in the Pacific theater. So instead of Europe over here, we're going to look at what happens on this side in the Pacific theater. All right, let's first of all start off with Pearl Harbor. That really was the first thing we were aware of a pre-planned, well-coordinated, massive Japanese attack on the entire region. That entire part of the Pacific theater there. They launch out all over the place, to the Philippines, down into Indochina. It was pre-planned. Pearl Harbor was the first thing we were aware of. Really, a lot of these attacks were kind of simultaneously going. It was just hours later that our forces are hit in the Philippines and so on. So this Pearl Harbor was just the start of this massive Japanese attack. I'll give you a few details, but essentially what happens here over the course of about 4 or 5 months, we have the Japanese taking everything that's in yellow here. Kind of this whole thing, Japan expands out and takes all that. Some of those pieces in Manchuria and other places were already theirs, but they expanded that fullest extent there in just about 5-6 months, 4 or 5 months, this pre-planned attack. Let me give a few details of that. We already know about Pearl Harbor. Some other places that were taken here very quickly were Guam and Wake. And then another place that wasn't taken quickly, and it's worth speaking about a little bit, is the Philippines. The attack in the Philippines, again, was just hours after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had planned on this being a relatively quick thing where they take it and then move on to other places, but our forces didn't cooperate. They held out there for much, much longer than the Japanese expected. General MacArthur was in the Philippines, and we were in the middle, if you remember way back to the Spanish-American War and our territories we got after that war. The Philippines was part of that territory. We were in the process of trying to turn the Philippines back over to the Filipino people. So the military and defenses were kind of in flux. We had been shifting everything over to the Filipinos, and MacArthur was actually kind of transitioning back the other way as he saw these looming war clouds and knew there was a real possibility of problems. He was shifting back the other way. So they kind of get caught halfway in between here, these two positions. MacArthur sometimes gets criticized for this. I don't think it's especially fair. This was a surprise attack. There's always some crazy conspiracies about, we knew about it and just let it happen. It was a surprise attack. But anyway, all that said, the Japanese attack the Philippines, eventually drive all of our forces back down to around Manila to a little peninsula called the Bataan Peninsula, and a little island just off the point there called Corregidor in the Bay at Manila. And these guys hold out for months. Eventually the guys on the peninsula, Bataan, surrender. I mean, they're out of food, out of weapons. It was an impossible situation. Those guys get sent on the Bataan Death March. The guys still on Corregidor, the little island off the point, hold out for a little bit longer, and then they are captured as well. So these guys fighting there really threw a roadblock in the Japanese plans of this rapid expansion. They actually had their forces that kind of enveloped the Philippines and gone on past it by this point. These guys were hundreds of miles behind enemy lines and cut off from any hope of help or assistance, and still they fought on for a very, very long time. Should mention a couple of other things I skipped over. MacArthur was there, like I said. He did not stay till the end. He wanted to. He was there with his wife and his son on Corregidor, and the story is that he would go out when the air raids were coming with his corncob pipe, and everyone's fleeing into the island for shelter, and he's going out, and he would count the planes as they came by and just try to get a sense of the situation. But he was there. Eventually the president orders him out, and he does escape. Now, if you're thinking with me here, the Japanese have envelop the whole island and have territory several hundred miles south. All right, it's not like he just hops on American Airlines and heads back home. He had to somehow get out. So this wasn't necessarily a guaranteed thing. But he and his wife and his son and some others, they get in the fastest boat they have and head straight south towards Australia. And obviously they make it, but he is able to escape out of the Philippines. One other quick note to mention here is our missionary, Dr. Patton. If you've been around long, he has come back a couple times for some medical care and has stayed in our dorms. He was living in the Philippines when this happened. His parents were missionaries, and they were there, I believe, in language school when the Philippines were taken over. He gets taken into a prison camp and spends several years there. Kind of ironically, they had been up in this part of China prior to the war and fled to the Philippines to avoid the Japanese invasion there. And then they get taken here. So if you happen to see Dr. Patton or know of him, he was here, an interesting tie at least. All right, so we have the Philippines being taken there after a significant fight. We have further other places that were taken. Hong Kong was taken on Christmas Day in 41. Further south down to Singapore, that was taken on February the 15th. And then by March-ish of the next year, we've got the Japanese all the way down to the end of that yellow territory down that direction. So very quick, if you think of December the 7th through March here, a very quick expansion, them taking lots and lots of territory. Now that's the first phase of the fighting here in the Pacific Theater. Maybe I should have mentioned all three phases before we got started. We're going to see the first phase here, this rapid Japanese expansion. The second phase, if you want to call it, the second part, is the transition, where we go from Japan expanding to them being stopped and then them being pushed back, the American and other forces driving them back. So we have that transition time, and then the third part, and the part that takes the most time, is that slow pushback of our forces driving the Japanese back all the way up here, culminating then with the attack, the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have those three phases. The first phase is that rapid expansion, which we just talked about. The Japanese just running over places, like I said, pre-planned, predetermined execution of a plan. Okay, now let's get to that turning point. What happens here that stops this juggernaut of expansion and allows us to begin to roll it back? There's really three things here. Two battles where we defeat and stop the Japanese outright, and then an event that takes place prior to those. So three things. The first thing that on the surface may not seem especially significant in the grand scheme of things took place on April 18th of 42. So it's December of 41, we have Pearl Harbor. So the next springtime, April the 18th, we have an event taking place here. A guy named Colonel Jimmy Doolittle dropped some bombs on Tokyo. Doolittle's raid, it was called. Tokyo and some other cities. This raid was not so much important that it just leveled Tokyo or something like that. They were aiming at industrial sites and trying to hamper their production capacity and that type of thing. But it ended up having a much more significant thing here. So let me back up and tell a little bit of the story here. The Japanese had pushed way out here, so our forces are way over here. Too far for our bombers to be able to take off from land anywhere and hit Tokyo and get back. So this whole plan is schemed of having bombers take off of aircraft carriers, and the plan was, which in itself was a major thing, cutting down the weight of the planes, just every possible little ounce, shaving off so they could take off. The carriers having to get up to full speed, and the planes taking off. Anyway, not a small thing, just getting them to take off the planes, off the carriers. But the plan was for them to get the fleet close enough so that these bombers could go and hit Tokyo and some other cities and come back. It works out that the Japanese fleet intervenes and stops them before they can get that close. So these guys took off here with an altered plan, and the plan was take off from the boats, do your bombing, and try to get over into China, someplace past the Japanese-controlled territory, and just land wherever you can figure it out. Really a mission where they knew they weren't coming back. At best, they would end up with the resistance forces in China. At worst, they're getting killed, or they're crash landing in Japanese territory and getting captured. But anyway, these guys do it. They take off, they bomb Tokyo, and crash land into China. Some of them get captured, some of them get killed. Surprisingly, few of them die in this thing. But if you just think about the bravery of these men, it really was an amazing feat. Beyond that, it had an amazing effect on Japan. All right, we said, you know, they bombed some things, but it didn't level the city. They didn't kill the emperor or anything like that. But it did do something to the psyche of the Japanese. They really had gotten to the point where they thought their island was untouchable. Nobody could touch their island. They'd taken enough territory that they were safe. Somebody might do something out here, but not there. So this caused them to want to push further. We saw this quick expansion and very successful expansion. This attack on Japan here by Doolittle caused them to want to push further. And it's in that next push that we see two victories on our side, or Japan defeated twice. And these three events here make up that hinge point. Let me give you the two battles that take place here right after this. So we have April 18th, Doolittle's raid. The next thing to take place is in May of 1942, that same year. We have the Battle of Coral Sea, way down here, May of 42. Japanese pushing further, wanting to take more territory, and our forces in place to stop them, and they defeat them. All right, so the Japanese are stopped down in the south. If you're into trivia questions, this was the first naval battle where neither fleet was ever in direct contact with each other. It was done by air warfare and long-range weapons, never direct physical contact of each other. So the Battle of Coral Sea, that was one of these results here of Doolittle's raid, where the Japanese make another punch to get more territory. And then the second is on the northern part of the territory, Midway, the Battle of Midway, up here, June of 42. So a month later, we see the Japanese driving that way. They were heading towards the Philippines. And here another amazing battle took place. The Japanese were coming at us with about 100 ships, and we had about 50. But it worked out that we were able to catch the Japanese off guard. And you have to kind of understand how these carriers work. They've got hundreds of planes on them, and on lower decks and all kinds of places. And it's a long process to bring them all up and have them launch off to get them into the air. And once they're in the air for so long, then they've got to come back and refuel, another long process. So we happen to catch them with their planes down in initial parts of this thing, and are able to do major damage because we caught them just at the right spot. The Patriots history textbook has this little phrase describing this battle. In the blink of an eye, the empire's hopes for victory had vanished. All right, this defeat there was significant in and of itself. The battle itself was amazing, but in the grand scheme of things, it really marks the end of Japanese push to expand. From this point on, it's a slow creep of us pushing them back and back and back. So now don't get the idea that this was not a painless victory for us. We did suffer major casualties. We have an aircraft carrier that gets sunk as they are able to get some planes in the air and send them back at us. And then we have the same problem. All of our planes are out of fuel and landing. So it's not a painless victory, but it is a victory there. All right, so we have that hinge point. We had the quick expansion, and then Doolittle's raid, Coral Sea, and Midway. That marks the hinge. From this point on, we're going to see a slow and painful and painfully slow drive to push the Japanese back towards Japan, and some very famous battles and some very ugly, brutal battles take place here in this scheme. All right, let me run down through some of these. We could spend days and days and days looking at these battles, and there are some very, very good books written about these things, and hopefully I can whet your appetite just a little bit so that sometime you can read about these things and at least be able to know the phase of the war that these things fit in. So, all right, let me give you a rundown of some of the places. Some of these we'll just kind of mention, not spend a whole lot of time on. All right, the first place that's taken is Guadalcanal. It's February of 43. Now we've got a little bit of a gap there. We have May and June of 42, Midway and Coral Sea. And it's not till February of 43, so 7-8 months before we're able to not just stop them on the ocean, but actually land forces and take territory way down there. Let me read you a quote here from a biography of MacArthur. This is talking about the landing there at Guadalcanal. 6 hours later, he went ashore in a pouring rain. The fighting was heavy. GIs of the 1st Cavalry Division wearing steel helmets and camouflage battle dress were lying prone. But the general, conspicuous in his trench coat and cap, awarded a Distinguished Service Cross to the man who led the first wave, and then, to the amazement of his party, strolled casually inland. Anguished aides tried to persuade him not to expose himself. One senior officer warned that he was in very intimate danger. MacArthur lit his corncob pipe, waved out the match, and explained that he wanted to get a sense of the situation. A lieutenant touched him on the sleeve, pointed at a path, and said, "Excuse me, sir, but we just killed a Jap sniper in there just a few minutes ago." The general nodded approvingly. "Fine," he said, "that's the best thing to do with him." And it goes on from there to talk about him going inland to more of the front line of the fighting. He was heading to, if I remember right, he wanted to see the airfield there to see if it was still intact enough and long enough for him to use. But anyway, he many times he does things like this on the battlefield. But that was Guadalcanal. There in February, a couple other places that are taken. The Marshall Islands are taken a full year later in 44, and then the Marianas are taken. They were important to us because Japan was launching some air raids off of those islands, and it would get in the way of us attacking the Philippines. So another step there towards the Philippines. And then finally, in the fall of 42, we get the attack on the Philippines. I'm sorry, the fall of 44. And it's good to remember, we start this whole process in 42. All right, so we're 2 years into it, over 2 years into it by this point. The attack on the Philippines starts in October. MacArthur approaches the Philippine Islands, the area of Leyte Gulf, on October the 22nd. And the next day, the Japanese launch a massive naval attack on him. You can see here, Leyte Gulf, October 44. The Japanese pulled their fleet from all over the Pacific, all kinds of places, pulled them over there to throw one last, hopefully death blow at MacArthur here in the Philippines. MacArthur manages to win this thing. The battle rages on the 23rd, 24th, and 25th. In this thing, the Japanese begin using kamikazes in their desperation. It's described as the greatest sea fight of this or any other war. Just a major, major battle there outside the Philippines. Both sides realizing the significance of this thing as we were closing in on Japan on the mainland here in the Philippines would be a major, major blow to them. So that was late October. We have the Battle of Leyte Gulf. MacArthur wins and then proceeds to land forces. And it was March of 45 that Manila is finally taken. Manila was the main city right there by Bataan and Corregidor. The main city there, Manila, is taken March of 45. There was still some sporadic fighting around the Philippine Islands. If you remember, there's just thousands of islands all over. Still sporadic fighting, but that really, March the 4th, ended the fighting for the most part in the Philippines. From that point on, we get to a couple of very famous battles, and they're justly famous, partly for the ferocity and also for the significance of them. All right, the next place to fall, it actually falls just shortly after Manila. Manila was March the 4th. This place falls on March the 16th, and that's the island of Iwo Jima, right out here, when it falls and is completely in American hands. The fighting before this time was really ferocious and nasty. It gets ramped up several notches here when we get to Iwo Jima. And for a very natural reason, Iwo Jima was part of Japan's original mainland, or not mainland, homeland. It wasn't something that they had taken prior to the war and their expansion into China. It wasn't part of this rapid expansion after Pearl Harbor. It was theirs already. So it'd be like somebody attacking Alaska for us. It's U.S. territory. This isn't just some place we happened to conquer a couple years beforehand. It's America. So the Japanese here ramp up their ferocity, and this is especially nasty, ugly fight. Basically, all 20,000 Japanese on the island are killed. We have about 6,000 Marines that get killed on the island. Some of the some of the units that land there have 84% casualty rates throughout this, and casualties both killed and wounded. One particular one, one of the more infamous ones, 250 guys land, 37 finish. 19 of those had been wounded and came back to the fight. Right, so it's just some nasty, nasty, ugly fighting. The Japanese had already dug trenches and tunnels and caves all through the island, so they were maneuvering underneath the whole time. We did bombard the place like crazy beforehand, but it really didn't destroy this too much. So anyway, just a major, ugly, ugly battle, which we take. Obviously, there's a famous picture taken there on top of the island, just completely by accident. The photographer was there to take a picture of this flag raising, but he heard the flag was going up and just turned around and snapped his camera and managed to capture that famous picture on Iwo Jima. All right, so that was, what we say, March of 45. The next place then to fall is Okinawa. We can see Iwo Jima, Okinawa here. We're getting closer and closer to Japan. It's taken in June the 21st of 45. Here about 100,000 Japanese are killed. We have about 12,000 killed and another 36,000 wounded. So just some ugly fighting. The Japanese, in desperation here, they do more than just use kamikazes. They sent about 5,000 kamikaze planes. But they also sent a warship on a kamikaze run here in their desperation to hold this off. Now, if you're thinking with me and remembering dates, it was May the 7th of this year that Germany surrendered. So by this point, the war in Europe is over, and it's just the war here. Okay, the next main thing to talk about is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These two places get hit with atom bombs. August the 6th for Hiroshima and August the 9th for Nagasaki. About 92,000 killed at Hiroshima, about 40,000 at Nagasaki. Let me give you a few details before this time. On July the 26th, the Allied forces, Allied leaders get together in Germany, a place called Potsdam, and they issue a warning to Japan, this ultimatum, surrender or it's going to get really, really bad. Japan obviously did not surrender. So this ultimatum is given. They don't surrender. So Truman authorizes the dropping of these two bombs. The only two we had. The whole story of the development of these weapons is amazing. But we dropped these two. That was August the 6th and 9th. And then it was September the 2nd of 45 that Japan surrenders to the Allied forces. Please don't believe the propaganda and lies about the dropping of these nuclear bombs as some sort of war crime and unjustified, and it was completely justified. Completely justified. Again, about 130,000 people get killed, and many more than that get injured and diseased and other things, but completely justified. The Japanese people were becoming increasingly fanatical. Their defenses of Iwo Jima and Okinawa illustrate that. But even beyond that, there are accounts of our soldiers approaching places and the civilians committing suicide rather than be captured. Families throwing their children off cliffs into the water and then jumping in after them, or even families huddling around a grenade to kill themselves. All right, so the invasion of Japan was going to be extremely ugly for both sides. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of Japanese that get killed, tens of thousands of Americans that get killed. This thing was completely justified, and really, in the grand scheme of things, it saved lives. It saved American lives, and it even saved Japanese lives. So don't believe this propaganda about the nuclear weapons here being unjustified. It's completely justified. So, all right, so September the 2nd, we have Japan surrendering. At that point, the war is over. Okay, now let's continue and talk about what happens after the war, or maybe the aftermath. Some of the stuff takes place during the war, just some other details that didn't fit into the progression of the battles necessarily. So a couple of things we need to talk about in the aftermath of the war. The first is the Nazi atrocities. The Germans killed millions and millions of people. It's estimated 4 to 6 million. but it's really hard to know. Just millions of people they killed off. If you go back and listen to Hitler's speeches and things going way back before the war, he's always blaming the Jews. It's the Jews' fault. He talks about the November criminals that surrendered in World War I and connects the November criminals with the Jews. The Jews are responsible for all of Germany's problems. And then as he takes power, he tries to figure out what to do with the Jews. He's wanting to completely get them out of the area, segregates them, strips away their rights, takes their property, takes their businesses, herds them into camps. As they drive into Russia, they kill them different ways. They shoot them in mass shootings. Eventually, they settle down with this final solution of just killing them all. Rather than trying to ship them out or other things like that, kill them all. And the most efficient way they could figure out how to do that was with the gas chambers. They would load them on trains, send them to these death camps, unload them. At that point, they would take their luggage, all kinds of things off of them, and send them for showers to get rid of the lice and other things, and kill them in just mass numbers in these death camps. All right, so just an amazing, it's amazing that in relatively recent history, we can have this type of atrocities taking place. As the war got to an end, we began to realize what was happening, but for the most part, because it was behind enemy lines, we didn't know exactly what was happening. So, all right, so that was taking place during the war. After the war, there were some trials called the Nuremberg trials, take place in Nuremberg, Germany. And this was trials for those Nazi leaders, the ones responsible for these things. Hitler didn't stick around for this, as often is the case with that type of person. So a lot of these guys get tried, the ones responsible for organizing and giving the orders for this stuff. But really, there's relatively few significant punishments given out. It's not like it should be. You would think, well, this should be obviously just executions on a grand scale here, justified executions on a grand scale, but that doesn't happen. There are quite a few convictions, but not real punishments like we would think of. I think one of the principal reasons for that is the Soviets were running the trials, and the Soviets were at least as guilty or more than the Nazis of similar types of things. I mean, we have Stalin, who starves out parts of the Ukraine, literally starves them out, puts his military around the area so they can't get out. So we have that guy in charge of the trials, and it's not especially surprising. All right, so we have the Nazi atrocities we need to mention. We also should mention some wartime conferences that take place. These are meetings of the Allied leaders. If you can just think of trying to get Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt together, wasn't necessarily an easy thing, but they managed to get together a couple of times. So I want to mention a couple quick ones. They meet 11 times. We'll just talk about 3 of them. They meet at one time in Tehran, down in present-day Iran. This is in 1943. And here by this point, there's some light at the end of the tunnel of hopefully winning this thing. So they began to talk about what to do with the conquered territory and this land that Germany had taken over, and they were going to reconquer back. Began to make those types of strategy. Churchill here was very distrustful of Stalin. Roosevelt, not so much so. Not surprisingly. All right, another one a little bit later is at Yalta. This takes place on the north side of the Black Sea. It was in Soviet territory. Stalin had gotten very, very schizophrenic and was afraid of everybody, so he didn't want to leave. He's afraid they would take over. It takes place in February of 45. This is just 2 months before Roosevelt dies. And here we see Roosevelt caving in to all kinds of demands of the Russians against Churchill. It was the 3 of them, so if Roosevelt sides with Stalin, then the vote goes that way. Things like having free elections in all this land that the Soviets are going to conquer from the Germans, but not have any outside inspectors to make sure it's free, just kind of leave everybody up to their own devices. The same thing happened in our areas. We, elections and set them free, just that the elections weren't free in the Soviet side. So we have all kinds of concessions here to the Soviets. Really sets the stage for the Iron Curtain that's dropped across Europe, as Churchill will describe later. All right, then the last one we mentioned actually when we're talking about the end of World War II is in Potsdam, Germany. This takes place just at the end of the war. We have a shift in leadership at this point. We now have Truman there for America and Clement Attlee there for Great Britain. Churchill had lost the election, and still Stalin. They issue the Potsdam Declaration, but beyond that, really, there's the arguments and discussion more gives us an illustration of the start of the Cold War as the Soviets are wanting to keep control of this territory, and America and Great Britain realizing kind of their position in this. So Potsdam, Germany, there just after the war ends in Germany, that one takes place. All right, the last thing we need to mention here in the aftermath is the United Nations. This thing officially comes into existence on July the 26th of 1945. All right, 50 delegates met in San Francisco, appropriate place for such an organization to be formed. This was supposedly an instrument that would settle international affairs, so that there was a dispute between two countries, they can go to the United Nations and help settle the dispute, so we wouldn't have to have World War III. We would avoid this type of thing. It's a complete failure in all senses of the word. More than anything, it's been used as an instrument historically for the Soviets to prevent any real addressing of their actions. A Soviet spy, Alger Hiss, was one of our instrumental agents there helping write the charter of this thing. It gives you some indication of the imbalanced nature of it. So I just want to mention a little bit about the structure of this thing and then mention a couple reasons why we have no reason to be in it at all. All right, first of all, the structure. The main body here is called the General Assembly. And this assembly, everybody gets one vote, or every country gets one vote, regardless of size. So kind of like our U.S. Senate, where every state gets 2 votes, regardless of size. There's not a corresponding house that represents the size of nations. So there's about half of the members of the UN are smaller than New York City in population, but their vote counts as much as the United States. You know, so it's very, very imbalanced here, unfair in that sense. So we have the General Assembly. They have meetings, and people go and talk. Their presidents, address the General Assembly. The other piece of this thing is called the Security Council. The other piece we want to talk about, the Security Council. This is 11 countries that are represented here. There are 5 permanent members: the United States, Great Britain, Russia, France, and China. These are permanent members. The other 6 rotate through from the other countries. And this council has the ability to stop certain actions of the General Assembly, kind of a check on that, things that they did. Mostly the Security Council is the place where Russia would veto and stop anything that condemned the Soviet Union. All those resolutions get squashed here. Those 5 permanent members had that power to veto any action that they didn't think was right. And the Soviets do that over and over and over again, stopping anything that disapproved of them. So we have the General Assembly and then the Security Council, a smaller member here of supposedly more select members of the UN. All right, now some reasons why we shouldn't be in it. All right, really it's the whole idea was foolish. And it's dumb for us to be there. Let me just list a couple of reasons. All right, one is it violates the principle, going back to Washington, of avoiding entangling alliances. I mean, we have just this web now of alliances that we're involved with in the UN. It messes up with that. All right, another thing is it takes away our national sovereignty. All right, we are giving over part of our ability to decide and defend ourselves to this United Nations. It's been several years back, but I remember there being some serious arguments, and I think legitimate arguments, about U.S. soldiers fighting under a UN commander. And they're saying, no, we pledged to the United States. not to the UN. And there's an argument whether those soldiers had to actually obey. I tend to say no. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't get court-martialed and go to jail. But we're giving that sovereignty away, a dangerous thing. So another thing here to think about is it violates Monroe's doctrine, that idea of you Europeans stay over there and we'll watch you kill each other and sell you weapons, and we'll stay over here. It violates that. And then one other reason here is America pays for just about everything. I mean, all of our actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, all those things, we pay for it. And on top of that, the UN wants us to pay dues. And there's actually a fight here. The UN says we're behind on our dues to the UN. We counter by saying, no, we paid for Iraq and Afghanistan. That's our dues. But they expect us to pay for all this stuff and then pay dues to the UN. It just, for a lot of these countries, it's a boondoggle where they're filtering money off of the United States. Again, not that we shouldn't carry our load, but only carry a fair load. So. All right, aftermath of the war. There's several things there that come out of this beyond the immediate consequences of the war that are significant. All right, the last thing we'll do today is talk about the Cold War, at least get the start of it done. I just want to give you kind of a general description of the whole thing. And the next class period, we will look at it in some more detail. So, Cold War, if you just had a very, very basic definition of it, it's a conflict between American ideas, Americanism, and communism, a conflict between individualism, America, England, individualism, and communism. That's the struggle. Now, it's a conflict because, I use that word because it wasn't necessarily always an open war. There's all kinds of spies and international agreements and, paying for weapons so other people can fight the Soviet Union. There's all kinds of indirect fighting here. So a conflict, not always a direct war. That's why the term Cold War is used in this setting. All right, so it's a conflict between Americanism and communism. Starts as World War II is ending. So in 1945, we see this thing pick up. And it runs all the way through 89 or 91, depending on how you want to look at the end of it. 89 is when we see the Soviet satellite nations beginning to break off the Soviet Union, and then 91 we see the Soviet Union collapsing. So up through basically 90, we have this Cold War raging. All right, let me mention three main areas, three main eras, time frames of this thing. This all is marking our approach to the Cold War. The Soviets' approach to the Cold War was pretty easy. We're going to bury them. I mean, Soviet leaders are talking about we're going to drive them into the dustbin of history and things like that. Their whole thing is we're going to beat America. Our approach to this changes and morphs a little bit through the years. So I want to mention the three main phases of our approach to this. Once we look at the details of this thing, we will follow this same pattern and look at these three phases and look at how our strategy and approach worked in each one. All right, the first phase is called the Truman Doctrine, or containment. By 1947, for sure, we have this Truman Doctrine in place, or the idea of containment. The basic thought is that we were going to help any country resist communist aggression, which sounds kind of nice, and I think we should. But there was no offensive part to this thing. It was just plain defense. So if the Soviets, one of the first places they went to was Greece, that shows up as actually in the context of Greece that Truman gives this doctrine. They were trying to take over Greece. So we went down and helped the opposition forces in Greece. But there was no thought of going to a communist area and trying to overturn it. It was just containment of them. So only plain defense. That was the Truman Doctrine. The second phase is called détente, D-E-T-E-N-T-E, détente. And this phase is, the détente is the idea of a lessening of tensions. And it was basically us trying to pretend like they didn't want to kill us. All right, it was lessening of tensions. And the thought on our side was if we were nice to them, then they'll be nice to us. And there's trade agreements, and we sell them grain and all kinds of things here, trying to kind of back down the tension in this thing. There's some, we're involved in Vietnam and some places like that, and we began to pull out of those areas so that our troops are not on the ground directly confronting communist forces. We're just trying to back down the tension. So détente is the next phase. And then the last phase we get in 80 when Reagan is elected. And I like Reagan's words for it. Someone asked him his view of the Cold War, and he said it's pretty simple. We win, they lose. He wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. And he comes into power and just goes full speed ahead and drives the Soviet Union into the ground. It doesn't collapse until after he leaves office, but he's the one that got the train headed over the edge with his policies. All right, so next class period we will look at those three phases of the Cold War, the types of things that happen, and some of the Cold War activities. So, all right, we'll see you then.